Welcome to the deep dive. So today we're getting into some really fascinating material actually sent in by a listener.
Oh, great.
Yeah, and this text, it really dives headfirst into quite a complex, maybe even controversial question. It's using logic to look at the relationship between Allah Isa, who you might know as the Islamic Jesus.
Okay.
And the central question it asks is pretty bold. Is Allah the father of Isa? I mean, that alone makes you stop and think, right?
Yeah.
Especially given the different theological views out there.
Absolutely. It's a striking question. And what makes this piece particularly interesting, I think, is the method it says it's using.
Right. The approach.
Exactly. It mentions the trivium, the classical learning framework,
Yeah.
grammar, logic, rhetoric, and specifically non-contradictory Aristotelian logic.
Okay.
And it claims quite strongly to be ideologically neutral, just focused on evidence, but through these logical steps.
So evidence-based logic, basically.
Yeah, that's the claim.
Yeah.
So our job today, I suppose, is to really unpack that, follow the logical path they lay out, see what arguments they build, and understand what the implications might be, especially for how Isa and maybe even Muhammad are viewed within Islam.
Okay, let's do it. So where does it start? What's the first step in this logical chain?
Well, it jumps right into what it frames as a major logical hurdle, an apparent contradiction right there in the Quran.
Okay.
It brings up Quran 112.3, and that verse is very clear, very direct. It says, Allah neither begets nor is begotten.
Right. No father, no son in that sense. Seems unambiguous.
It really does. It's a cornerstone of Islamic theology, isn't it? Emphasizing God's absolute uniqueness, transcendence, no divine family tree like humans have.
But then there's always a but then with these things, isn't there?
Exactly. Then the text brings in another key verse, Quran 19.20. This is Maryam, Mary, asking, quite naturally, how can I have a son when no man has touched me?
The virgin birth.
Precisely. The miraculous conception of Isa. And this is where the source poses its sort of central logical question.
Which is?
If Isa had no human father, well, then who is his father, logically speaking?
Okay. Setting up the problem. No human father, but a birth occurred. So what's the initiating force?
You've got it. It's a very direct line of reasoning. If we accept the premise, Isa's virgin birth, stated in the Quran, then the usual explanation for fatherhood just isn't there.
Right.
So the text argues that you have to look at who or what initiated Isa's existence.
Okay, so where does the source go with that? Who do they identify?
Well, it doesn't really beat around the bush. It argues that in any rational system, the initiator of a child's existence is the father.
The ultimate cause.
Yes. And then it points to specific Quranic verses as evidence. There's Quran 66.1, which talks about Maryam. We breathed into her of our spirit.
Our spirit, meaning Allah's spirit.
That's the interpretation presented, yes.
All right.
And also Quran 19.21, where Isa's birth is called, this is a sign from your Lord.
Okay, so the argument is Allah used his spirit, his command, his direct action to make Isa exist. Therefore,
the text concludes, Allah initiated it. He is the cause, the father in this logical framework.
that's a strong claim, especially given the verse we started with.
It is. And notice how carefully it uses those specific verses. It's zeroing in on the divine action precisely because the human element is missing. The breathing of the Spirit, the sign from your Lord, these are presented as direct causal acts by Allah.
Very cause and effect. Okay. But what about Gabriel? Doesn't he often feature in the story?
Good point. And the source anticipates that. It acknowledges Jibril's role mentioned in the Quranic narrative.
Right, delivering the message to Maryam.
Exactly. But the text quickly argues he can't be the father. It cites verses like Quran 19.1 and 16.2, which describe Jibril as purely a messenger. He's following Allah's orders.
So the distinction is creating versus delivering a message.
Precisely. The source insists that a father creates or initiates. Jibril, in this view, is just the delivery guy, the agent, not the originator. He's carrying out God's will.
Okay, that makes sense within their logical structure. They're building a case that the ultimate responsibility, the initiation, lies solely with Allah.
That's the core of it, establishing that hierarchy. Allah commands and creates. Jibril obeys and delivers. This reinforces the idea that Isa's existence stems directly from Allah's action.
Which inevitably brings us back full circle to that first verse.
Yep, back to the apparent clash with Quran 112.3.
He begets not, nor is he begotten.
And the source really leans into this. It says, look, if Allah directly causes a son to exist, then logically he is begetting, regardless of how you phrase it.
So a direct contradiction is identified.
According to the source's logical interpretation, yes. It presents it as a head-on collision. And interestingly, it also notes what it perceives as a kind of silence or lack of direct confrontation of this paradox within mainstream Islamic theology. It finds that silence significant.
Hmm. Okay, so the argument is cause implies fatherhood, fatherhood implies begetting, begetting contradicts Q112.3. That's the logical chain.
That's essentially the structure they've built, yes. Applying a very strict definition of father and beget based purely on causation. If A causes B, A is the father.
Interesting. Does it compare this to other traditions, like Christianity?
It does. It brings up the idea of Allah's transcendence, contrasting it with, say, the Christian concept in Luke's gospel, where the Holy Spirit directly causes Mary's conception.
Right. Often seen as a more direct fathering role for God in Christian theology.
Exactly. The source points out that Islamic tradition emphasizes Allah's absolute separation, his transcendence. It cites Quran 17.43. Exalted is he and high above what they say.
And the use of Jibril as an intermediary fits that.
Yes, Jibril acting as a sort of proxy, as mentioned in Quran 19.1 scene regarding the Annunciation. The source suggests that even though Islam emphasizes this divine distance and the use of angels,
the logical implication of causation still stands.
That's the argument. The perceived distance doesn't negate the fundamental act of initiation by Allah, according to this text. And building on this, it then throws out some pretty challenging questions.
Like what?
Well, kind of rhetorical questions, like do angels in Islam procreate? Obviously not. Generally understood.
Right.
So if Jibril's role was creative somehow, why isn't he called the father? And then the kicker. If Allah does initiate the existence of a son, why shy away from calling him the father?
Wow. Yeah, those are designed to make you really think about the definitions being used, pushing the boundaries of that word father and beget.
Definitely. They're designed to expose what the text sees as maybe logical inconsistencies if you try to have the virgin birth without accepting the begetting implication, given Q112.3. Keep circling back to Allah's direct action logically means a paternal role.
Okay. Now, the source also talks about Isa's status in Islam generally, right? Beyond just the birth narrative.
Oh, yes, very much so.
Yeah.
It spends time highlighting Isa's unique position within the Quran itself.
What kind of things does it mention?
Well, it lists the clear Quranic statements about his virgin birth being by Allah's direct will and command, citing verses like Quran 3.4547.
Okay.
Then his miracles healing the blind, raising the dead, things like that, mentioned in Quran 3.49.
Yeah.
And also his ascension into heaven, again, directly by Allah, citing Quran 4.158.
So painting a picture of someone exceptionally favored by God with clear divine power demonstrated through him.
Absolutely. The text compiles these points to show Isa isn't just any prophet in the Quranic narrative. He's presented with extraordinary signs and a very direct connection to divine power.
And how does this compare to, say, Muhammad's portrayal in the Quran, according to this source?
This is a crucial part of the argument. The source then draws a sharp contrast. It points to Quran 17.59, which explicitly says Muhammad wasn't given the same kind of miraculous signs as earlier prophets.
Okay.
And it highlights Quran 29.50, where Muhammad describes himself primarily as a warner.
Just a messenger, a warner, not necessarily a miracle worker in the same vein as Isa?
That's the distinction the source emphasizes. Yeah. It argues the Quran itself depicts Isa with unique divine favor, miraculous abilities tied directly to Allah.
I see. So highlighting Isa's uniqueness serves a purpose in their overall argument about fatherhood.
It seems so. By establishing Isa's exceptional status based on Quranic evidence, it reinforces the idea that Isa's origin itself is uniquely tied to direct divine action.
Okay, so let's get to the conclusion. What's the final verdict from this source text?
It circles back very firmly to its main point. Logically, it argues Allah's direct causation of Isa's existence makes him Isa's father, period. Regardless of Quran 112.3.
It just states that as the logical outcome.
Pretty much. And then it offers an interpretation for why this conclusion, which it sees as logically necessary, might be resisted in Islamic thought.
And what's that reason?
It suggests, controversially I'd imagine, that denying Allah as Isa's father might be motivated by a desire to elevate Muhammad's status above Isa's.
How so?
The idea presented is that if you acknowledge Allah as Isa's father, it puts Isa in this incredibly unique position. The source uses the phrase, favored son of Allah.
Okay.
And acknowledging that, the source implies, could potentially complicate the narrative of Muhammad being the final and ultimate prophet. So denying the fatherhood aspect, even if logically implied by the virgin birth, serves to, let's say, maintain a certain theological hierarchy.
Connecting the logical argument to motivations about the relative status of Isa and Muhammad.
It is. That's the argument presented.
And the very final word from the source.
Based purely on the logic of cause and effect, Allah is Isa's father. And it dismisses other theological explanations that try to reconcile Q112.3 with the virgin birth as, essentially, Islamic word games designed to avoid this logical conclusion.
So, wrapping this up then, this deep dive has really exposed a core tension highlighted by this text. You've got the Quran saying Allah doesn't beget, but also describing Isa's birth as directly caused by Allah without a human father.
Exactly. A real point of tension when examined through this particular logical lens.
And the key takeaway from the source's analysis is that if you strictly apply the logic of causation, A causes B, therefore A is the initiator father, then Allah's role makes him Isa's father.
Right. Which, according to the source, potentially gives Isa a very distinct, perhaps elevated theological standing within Islam itself. It's interesting how this approach really forces a confrontation with how we use words like father or beget when talking about the divine.